All right, let's set the stage here. If you look at the VR landscape right now, it is completely dominated by these massive AAA blockbusters. I mean, we're talking absolute giants. Games like Batman, Arkham Shadow, and Asgard's Wrath 2 just sucking up all the oxygen in the room. But quietly, completely under the radar, this small indie title called Arken Age has been building some serious momentum. Players who actually stumble upon it are swearing up and down that it's one of the absolute best, most satisfying combat experiences you can get on the MetaQuest 3 right now. So we've got to ask the hard question. In a sea of heavy hitters, does this indie David versus Goliath story actually hold up? Does Arken Age really warrant all this hype? Or are VR fans just kind of lowering their standards to justify buying a headset?
Welcome, everyone. I am super excited to jump right into today's explainer because we are unpacking what might literally be the undercover VR masterpiece of the year. When a small development team drops a game that can genuinely go toe-to-toe with the biggest budgets in the industry, we need to take a close look at the mechanics, the data, and the actual player reception to figure out exactly how they pulled it off.
Okay, let's quickly check our quest log for this explainer. We're going to cover exactly what Arken Age is, the physics of its combat, how it actually performs on a standalone Quest 3, what's holding it back from perfection, and then wrap up with our final verdict. Let's get into it.
Section 1. What is Arken Age? Time to enter the biochasm. Look, for years now, VR players have been practically begging for a really meaty Skyrim and VR experience. You know, a full single-player action-adventure that isn't just a glorified tech demo or a quick arcade wave shooter. Well, Arken Age steps right up to fill that void by dropping you into the biochasm. This place is wild. It's a terraformed fantasy world that brilliantly mashes up biological alien life with this decaying, rusty cybernetic architecture. The lore is that it was created by a divine figure called the Grand Arborist who has just mysteriously vanished. And the cool part? You aren't playing as some standard human hero. You embody a biological weapon called the Untethered One, and your main objective is to fight back against the Hyperion, this robotic race that's suffering from a nasty neural corruption.
What really makes this game take are its core pillars. First off, you're getting a solid 10 to 15-hour narrative campaign. That is huge for VR veterans who are sick of bite-sized games, but maybe found something like Asgard's Wrath 2 just a little too bloated. You're getting full physics swordplay, open-world exploration, and deep traversal mechanics. And by deep traversal, I mean you are physically flicking your wrists to slam climbing picks into a wall, or using your real arms to swim 360 degrees underwater. Toss in 32 custom weapon mods, and you've got this deeply physical, incredibly tactile adventure. Section 2. The physics of combat. Arguably the most important thing in VR. We all know that combat is the absolute make or break factor for any VR title. If hitting something doesn't feel right, the entire illusion completely shatters. Remember the early days of VR? We had a lot of what's known as waggle-based combat. You could just kind of lazily flick your wrist, the game would trigger a pre-canned animation, and suddenly the enemy died. It felt like fighting with balloon swords. There was zero weight. Arken Age throws that totally out the window. It uses a one-to-one physics-based engine that actively calculates the simulated weight of your weapon and the actual velocity of your swing. Enemies react dynamically when you parry them, and if you swing hard enough, you can physically dismember their mechanical armor. It's spring-loaded, it's meaty, and it actually requires you to put some muscle into it. And the combat gets incredibly creative, too. Reviewers have been raving about the sheer joy of the weapon modding system. Like the God Axe, you can actually upgrade it so you're hurling just the axe head to rip right through enemies before calling it back to your hand. Or my favorite, the Gravity Mace. You literally tap an enemy with it and it sends them rocketing straight up into the sky like a ragdoll firework. The spellcasting and the weapon mods aren't just cheap gimmicks here. They fundamentally change your entire approach to every single fight. So where does this land on the ultimate VR combat scale? If we say a 1 is your baseline physics like Blade and Sorcery Nomad, and a 10 is the ultimate AAA polish of Asgard's Wrath 2, we're rating the combat feel of Arken Age a phenomenally solid 9 out of 10. It is really that good. Moving on to Section 3, Quest 3 Standalone Performance, or as I like to call it, absolute engineering magic. Now, Arken Age was originally built as a flagship title for high-end PC VR and the PlayStation VR 2. Porting a massive, heavily physics-dependent game down to a mobile chipset is notoriously brutal. To get this thing running natively on the MetaQuest 3 at a stable 72 to 80 Hz, the developers at Vitruvius VR had to make some very calculated sacrifices. Textures had to be scaled back, dynamic lighting was swapped for flat-baked lighting, and water transparency was totally removed.
especially when you compare that to the PS5 Pro, which is running dynamic foveated rendering and high-res shadows at a native 90 Hz. The Quest 3 version sounds pretty compromised on paper, right?
Actually, no. As one prominent reviewer pointed out, I can't think of a better Quest port in the history of VR so far. Because the developers leaned into this vibrant, jewel-toned, heavily color-saturated art style, those graphical downgrades honestly kind of melts away the second you put the headset on. The world still feels utterly massive, the frame rate stays remarkably stable even when crazy physics calculations are happening all around you, and the full-body inverse kinematics, which is the system mapping your real physical body to your alien avatar, is flawlessly smooth. It is truly a masterclass in standalone optimization.
Which brings us to Section 4. What holds it back? Why is there an 8 out of 10 ceiling on this game?
So, despite all this glowing praise for the combat and the port itself, Arken Age still generally hovers around an 8 out of 10 in the critical consensus. What's stopping it from being a perfect 10? Well, an academic analysis of player retention uncovered a really brutal phenomenon dubbed tutorial churn. Check this out. A staggering 93% of players abandoned the game before they even finished the second combat tutorial. 93%! Why? Because the initial pacing is, frankly, a slog. You're stuck at this command desk, listening to slow, segmented instructions. The game demands a lot of physical effort right out of the gate, and for a ton of players, that sluggish opening is an absolute deal-breaker they just don't have the patience for. And to be perfectly objective, the tutorial isn't the only rough edge. If you look at the consensus, there are a few other limiting factors. You've got those slow, intimidating menu tutorials. And while the vertical climbing is awesome, vaulting over ledges horizontally can feel really floaty and imprecise. If you're playing on the Quest 3, you're definitely going to be wading through some noticeably long loading screens between zones. Also, while the world's lore is super interesting, the actual story narrative is pretty predictable. And finally, while the melee combat is a 9 out of 10, the gunplay just lacks that punchy oomph you'd get from a dedicated VR shooter. We've got to weigh the bad with the good.
And finally is Section 5, the final verdict. To buy or not to buy? Taking everything into account, the whole David versus Goliath vibe, the incredibly visceral one-to-one physics combat, the absolute black magic of the Quest 3 optimization, and yes, that undeniably clunky tutorial pacing. What's our final verdict? Based on all the data, Arken Age is a definitive buy for VR action enthusiasts. Yes, you are going to have to grit your teeth through a tedious first hour, but I promise, once you're actually out there exploring the biochasm, the sheer magic of that tactile presence, the epic scale of the boss fights, and the depth of the weapon modding totally take over. It proves that a tiny indie team can deliver a game that feels AAA, respects your intelligence, and truly honors your physical presence in the virtual world. It's a platinum standard for indie VR, and for sure worth full price.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to mull over. What is your personal gold standard when it comes to VR melee combat? For the longest time, Blade and Sorcery has basically worn the crown for pure physics feel. But with games like Arken Age pushing the absolute limits of what standalone hardware can do, has the Quest 3 finally matched that standard? Think about your own experiences. What makes a virtual swing of a sword truly satisfying to you, and how games like this are fundamentally changing the medium? Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.